blood, bronze, and the brutal calculus of organized slaughter. For 3 centuries, one warrior system dominated the battlefields of the ancient Mediterranean world. Not because it was pretty, not because it was honorable, but because it turned ordinary men into components of the most terrifying killing machine the world had ever seen. The Greek Hoplite wasn't a hero from mythology. He was something far more dangerous. He was engineered violence. 70 pounds of bronze armour encasing flesh and bone. A 9-foot spear designed for one purpose, to punch through human bodies at close range, and a shield so heavy, so brutally effective that it transformed individual terror into collective devastation. This wasn't warfare as we romanticize it. This was industrialized carnage in the Age of Bronze. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, close enough to smell the fear on their brothers, pushing forward into a wall of iron-tipped death. The front ranks knew they were doomed. The question wasn't if you'd die, it was whether you'd break before the man next to you. When 2 phalanxes collided, the sound was described as thunder made flesh, shields crashing into shields, spears splintering through armour, men crushed by the sheer weight of their own comrades pushing from behind. And in that moment of impact, warfare became something primordial, something terrifying, something that would define Western military thought for millennia. This is the brutal truth. This is the anatomy of a killing machine. This is the Hoplite. If you're ready to dive into the blood-soaked reality of ancient warfare, hit that like button and subscribe. We're going deep into the mechanics of death, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Ring that bell, because this is Wars in History and we don't do fairy tales. The year is 490 BCE. A Persian invasion force, somewhere between 25,000 and 100,000 strong, has landed on the plains of Marathon, barely 26 miles from Athens. The greatest empire the world has ever known has come to crush a tiny city-state that dared to defy it. The Athenians can field maybe 10,000 men. They are outnumbered, outflanked, facing professional soldiers backed by the infinite resources of Persia. By every logical calculation, Athens should have been annihilated that day. But something happened on that plain, something that would echo through military history for the next 2,500 years. The Athenian hoplites, these heavily armoured citizen soldiers, charged into the Persian lines, and they didn't just win, they slaughtered. The Persians, with their wicker shields and light armour, broke against the Greek phalanx like waves against stone. 6,400 Persian dead, 192 Greek casualties. It wasn't magic. It wasn't divine intervention. It was engineering. The hoplite was a weapons system, refined over generations into something devastatingly effective. And to understand how a few thousand Greeks could break the armies of an empire, you need to understand what a hoplite actually was. The word hoplite comes from Hoplon, though scholars will tell you that's technically imprecise. It refers to the massive shield these warriors carried, but it also became shorthand for the entire system. The armour, the weapons, the formation, the brutal philosophy that turned farmers and merchants into soldiers capable of standing in the face of massed cavalry and not breaking. Because here's what most people don't understand. The hoplite wasn't created for glory. He was created for survival. In the turbulent centuries of archaic Greece, the city-states needed a military system that could be maintained by ordinary citizens, not professional warriors. They needed something that could turn a blacksmith or a wine merchant into a functional soldier, and they needed it to be effective enough to win battles without requiring years of specialized training. What they created was revolutionary. Not because it was complex, but because it was simple, brutally, terrifyingly simple. A hoplite's panoply, his full set of armour and weapons, weighed around 70 pounds. That's the equivalent of carrying a small adult on your body while trying to fight for your life. The bronze cuirass alone could weigh up to 14 pounds, the shield another 16. Add the helmet, the greaves, the spear, the sword, and you're looking at a man who could barely move at speed, much less manoeuvre with agility. But here's the genius. He didn't need to. The hoplite system wasn't built on individual prowess. It was built on collective mass. One hoplite was vulnerable, slow, exhausted, easy prey for faster, lighter troops. But put 8 ranks of hoplites shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, spears bristling forward like the spines of some bronze beast, and you created something that ancient armies simply could not break. The phalanx formation was mathematical violence. Each man occupied roughly 3 feet of frontage. His massive shield protected not just himself, but half of the man to his left. This created an interdependence that was both tactical and psychological. If you broke ranks, you didn't just endanger yourself, you exposed your brother in arms. The shame of cowardice wasn't abstract. It was measured in the blood of the man who trusted you to hold the line. And that's where the Othismos came in. The push. After the initial spear thrusts, after the chaos of the first contact, the phalanx became a literal shoving match. The rear ranks pressed forward with their shields against the backs of the men in front. The entire formation became a single organism, using its collective weight to physically drive the enemy backward. Men in the front ranks were crushed against enemy shields, unable to retreat, unable to escape. They fought or they died. This was warfare stripped down to its most primal essence. Not the clean, heroic duels of Homer, but compression, suffocation, the terror of being trapped between bronze and flesh with nowhere to go. The Greeks who pioneered this system understood something fundamental about human psychology. Individual courage is fragile, it breaks. But collective momentum, the sensation of being part of an unstoppable mass, of sharing the burden of terror with the men beside you, that could sustain warriors through the unthinkable. The phalanx didn't make men braver, it made their cowardice irrelevant. At Marathon, this system met its ultimate test. The Persians fought in looser formations, relying on archers and cavalry to soften enemies before closing for melee. Their infantry wore padded linen armour, carried light wicker shields. They were mobile, flexible, designed for the sweeping campaigns of empire. The hoplites were designed for one thing, to stand and grind you into the earth. When the two forces collided, the Persians learned a brutal lesson. Their arrows couldn't penetrate the bronze. Their lighter weapons couldn't match the 9-foot reach of the Doru spear. And when the phalanx began its forward push, the Persian line simply disintegrated. Men trampled, crushed, speared in the press of bodies. The Battle of Marathon wasn't won by Greek virtue, it was won by Greek engineering. By a weapon system so effective that it would dominate Mediterranean warfare for the next 300 years, until the Macedonians refined it even further with the sarissa pike, and created the phalanx that would conquer the known world under Alexander the Great. But every machine has its weaknesses, every system has its fatal flaws, and the hoplite, for all its brutal effectiveness, was no exception. It was vulnerable to terrain, vulnerable to flanking, vulnerable to tactical flexibility, and perhaps most critically, it was vulnerable to its own rigidity. The very thing that made it strong, that unyielding, immovable mass, also made it brittle. To understand the hoplite is to understand the paradox of all military innovation. Strength and weakness are often the same thing, viewed from different angles. The question isn't whether a system is perfect, it's whether it's effective enough to win before its flaws are exploited. So let's break down the machine, component by component. Let's examine the panoply that protected the warrior, the shield that defined the formation, the weapons that dealt death at spear's length and sword's edge, the phalanx itself, that terrible algorithm of organized violence, and finally, the flaws that would eventually see the hoplite system swept aside by more flexible, more adaptable ways of war. This is the anatomy of a killing machine, and it starts with the armour that turned men into bronze gods. The word panoply comes from the Greek panoplia, literally meaning all arms. It was the complete kit, the full armour system that transformed a naked citizen into a walking fortress of bronze. But this wasn't ceremonial decoration. Every piece of the panoply was engineered for a specific purpose, to keep you alive long enough to kill the man in front of you. And to understand the hoplite, you need to understand that this armour wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for survival in the most brutal close-quarters combat the ancient world had ever systematized. Let's start with the centerpiece, the thorax, the cuirass that protected the torso. In the archaic period, wealthy hoplites wore the bell cuirass, a bronze breastplate hammered from a single piece of metal, flared at the bottom like a bell to deflect incoming missiles and spear thrusts. This design dated back to at least the late 8th century BCE and remained remarkably consistent for over 250 years. The bell cuirass was a masterwork of bronze smithing, featuring stylized musculature that both intimidated enemies and provided structural reinforcement. But it was the classical period that produced the armour we most associate with, the Greek hoplite, the muscle cuirass or anatomical cuirass, which took the concept further, literally sculpting the warrior's idealized physique in bronze. The muscle cuirass was art and engineering fused into a single deadly purpose. Bronze hammered thin enough to be workable, thick enough to stop a spearhead. The front and back plates were shaped to mimic human musculature, pectorals, abdominal muscles, even the serratus anterior. This wasn't vanity. The curves and ridges distributed impact force, deflecting blows rather than absorbing them directly. The cuirass weighed between 12 and 14 pounds, fitted with hinges and pins on the sides for closure. The right side typically featured multiple pins. The vulnerable side, the side your shield didn't protect. The left side often had an overlapping lip system that allowed some adjustment for weight gain or loss, critical for citizen soldiers whose bodies change between campaigns. Some cuirasses extended low enough to protect the groin, while others were paired with pteryges, leather or linen strips that hung from the bottom edge to protect the thighs, while allowing freedom of movement. But here's the reality that art and museums don't tell you. Bronze cuirasses were obscenely expensive. We're talking about 50 to 100 drachmas for a full panoply, with the cuirass alone potentially costing a significant portion of that sum. For context, a skilled labourer in 5th century Athens earned maybe 5 obols a day, 6 obols to a drachma. That means a full bronze panoply could represent months of wages. This was not equipment for the common man. The wealthiest hoplites, the aristocratic class, wore bronze. Everyone else needed an alternative. Enter the linothorax. The linothorax was revolutionary precisely because it democratized armour. Made from layers of linen, estimates range from 12 to 20 layers, glued or stitched together into a rigid composite, it provided protection at a fraction of the cost and weight of bronze. Modern reconstructions by scholars like Gregory Aldrete use 17 layers of linen laminated with glue. creating armour that weighed around 8 pounds compared to the 14-pound bronze cuirass. Testing showed it could stop arrows and resist sword cuts, though it was less effective against the direct thrust of a spear than bronze. The lenothorax was shaped like a tube that fitted over the torso, with shoulder pieces called epimedes that stood up stiffly when unsecured. The bottom was cut into pteryges strips for mobility. Ancient sources describe it being made from twined linen threads or layered fabric, possibly hardened with substances like vinegar or animal glue. The result was armour that was cheaper, lighter and cooler, critical in the Mediterranean summer when heat exhaustion could kill you faster than enemy spears. Now, the helmet. The iconic Corinthian helmet defines our image of the hoplite, and for good reason. It was as effective as it was terrifying. Hammered from a single piece of bronze covering the entire head except for narrow eye slits and a T-shaped opening for the nose and mouth, it provided near-total protection for the face and skull. The helmet featured cheek guards that curved to protect the sides of the face, a nasal guard that extended down to shield the nose, and a bowl that covered the back and sides of the head down to the neck. It weighed between 3 and 4 pounds. The design was so efficient that it remained virtually unchanged for over 2 centuries, though variations emerged, the Illyrian, the Chalcidian, each offering different trade-offs between protection and visibility. But the Corinthian helmet had a fatal flaw: sensory deprivation. The all-enclosing design that protected your face also restricted your peripheral vision to almost nothing. The slits were narrow, designed to prevent spear points from penetrating. You couldn't see to your sides. You couldn't see above or below except in a narrow frontal cone, and worse, you couldn't hear. The bronze blocked sound, muffling orders, making it nearly impossible to know what was happening beyond your immediate front. In the Phalanx, this was manageable. You didn't need peripheral vision, you needed to see the man directly in front of you, the one you were trying to kill. Your shield wall protected your flanks. The formation itself compensated for your blindness. But if the formation broke, if you were caught alone, that helmet transformed from protection into a death trap. You couldn't see the spear coming from the side, couldn't hear the enemy flanking you. The very thing that made you invulnerable in formation made you helpless outside it. Finally, the greaves, the bronze shin guards that protected the lower legs from knee to ankle. These were shaped from single pieces of bronze, curved to fit the contours of the leg, often anatomically sculpted to show the muscle definition of the calf and shin, the fascinating detail. Most greaves had no straps. They were held in place purely by the springiness of the bronze itself, shaped to grip the leg through tension. You literally snapped them onto your shins, and the metal's own elasticity kept them in place. This meant they had to be custom fitted to the wearer, hammered and adjusted until the fit was perfect. Too tight and they'd cut off circulation, too loose and they'd fall off in combat. Greaves typically weighed 2 to 3 pounds for the pair, adding to the total burden but protecting one of the most vulnerable areas. Your legs were exposed below the shield, prime targets for low spear thrusts. Add it all together. Bronze cuirass, 14 pounds, helmet, 5 pounds, greaves, 3 pounds, shield, 16 pounds, spear, 2 to 3 pounds, sword, 2 pounds. You're carrying somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds of equipment on a bronze-armoured hoplite, slightly less for a linothorax-equipped soldier, and you're expected to march miles to the battlefield, hold formation in the suffocating heat, and then fight for your life while carrying that weight. This wasn't armour you could wear all day. Hoplites often carried their armour to the battlefield and donned it just before combat, using slaves or attendants to help with the fitting. Because once you were encased in bronze, you were committed. There was no running in this armour, no quick manoeuvres. You were slow, ponderous, vulnerable to faster troops, but in formation, in the Phalanx, you were something else entirely. You were a component of a machine that could break armies. The Panoply wasn't designed for individual combat. It was designed for collective violence. The weight that made you slow made you unstoppable in the forward push. The helmet that blinded you didn't matter when you had 8 ranks of brothers behind you, all moving as one. The armour that would bankrupt a poor farmer became affordable when the state or wealthy patrons subsidised it, or when you stripped it from dead enemies after victory. The Greeks understood something fundamental. Individual weakness, when organised correctly, becomes collective strength. The Panoply embodied that philosophy. It turned vulnerable flesh into bronze, and bronze, when arrayed in ranks, became death itself. The Aspis wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was the soul of the Phalanx. Roughly 3 feet in diameter, about 97 centimetres, and weighing approximately 16 pounds, this circular shield with its distinctive concave bowl shape defined hoplite warfare more than any other single element. You could strip a hoplite of his helmet, his cuirass, even his spear, and he'd still be recognisable by that massive wooden disc. Because the Aspis wasn't designed to protect just you, it was designed to protect the man standing to your left, creating an interlocking wall that was greater than the sum of its parts. And that fundamental design principle, individual sacrifice for collective survival, was what made the Greek Phalanx the most terrifying military formation of its age. The construction of the Aspis was deceptively simple, yet brilliantly engineered. The core was wood, typically poplar or willow according to the botanist Theophrastus, contemporary of Aristotle. These were chosen for specific reasons. They were light, resilient, and possessed self-healing properties that allowed the wood to absorb impacts without catastrophic splitting. Archaeological evidence reveals 2 primary construction methods. The best-known example, the Bomazo shield housed in the Vatican Museum, features a single layer of wooden planks placed edge to edge, then either lathed, carved, or steam bent to create the bowl shape approximately 5 to 6 inches deep. The alternative method, evidenced by fragmentary finds, used 2 or 3 layers of thinner slats cross-laminated and bent under tension, creating an especially resilient composite dome that could flex under impact without breaking. The bowl shape itself was crucial. Modern experimental archaeology has proven what ancient craftsmen understood intuitively. The concavity distributed impact energy laterally rather than directly through the shield. When a spear struck a flat shield at a 90-degree angle, the wood split at impact energies as low as 12 joules, well below the force of even a moderate spear thrust. But the curved surface of the Aspis deflected that energy, forcing incoming strikes to glance off rather than penetrate. Testing showed that wooden segments laid flat split more than 75% of the time under forces that the curved Aspis absorbed without failure. The dome design meant that a comparable flat shield would need to be significantly thicker and therefore heavier to provide equivalent protection. The outer face of the shield received a bronze covering, though not the thick bronze you might imagine. The facing was remarkably thin, approximately 0.5 millimeters in thickness, just enough to add structural rigidity and deflect weapons without adding prohibitive weight. Modern reconstructions testing authentic bronze-faced aspides against arrows, javelins, and spears showed the bronze deflecting projectiles that would have penetrated bare wood. The bronze didn't need to stop the weapon through sheer thickness. It needed to deflect it, turning killing blows into glancing strikes. This thin bronze layer added roughly 2 to 3 pounds to the shield's total weight, but dramatically increased its effectiveness. Some shields featured decorative elements on the bronze, the famous lambda for Lacedaemon on Spartan shields, Gorgon heads, other emblems meant to intimidate enemies and identify units. These weren't vanity, they were psychological warfare cast in metal. The inner surface received a leather lining for comfort and to prevent the wood from splintering inward if struck. A 3-inch rim ran around the circumference, offset from the bowl, providing structural reinforcement and a mounting point for the grip system. And it's this grip system, the Argive grip, that revolutionized shield warfare and made the Phalanx possible. Unlike earlier shields carried by a single central hand grip, the Aspis employed a 2-point system that distributed its considerable weight across the forearm. The porpax was a bronze or leather band mounted at the shield center, through which you thrust your left arm up to the elbow. The antilabe was a cord or leather handle positioned at the rim, which you gripped with your left hand. This arrangement was biomechanically brilliant. The porpax positioned the shield center of mass at your forearm, allowing you to bear the 16-pound weight without your arm muscles collapsing from fatigue. The antilabe gave you fine control, letting you angle and maneuver the shield with relatively little effort. You could rest the sharp interior curve of the bowl on your left shoulder, taking the weight off your arm entirely during marches or while standing in formation. The shield essentially enclosed you. You stood inside its center of gravity, protected by a mobile wall that moved with you. But the genius and the curse of the system were inseparable. The porpax locked your arm in place. You couldn't simply drop the shield if you needed to run. Releasing the antilabe wasn't enough. You had to pull your entire arm back through the porpax, a process that took precious seconds in the chaos of combat. The Greeks had a word for a soldier who abandoned his shield, ripsaspis, shield thrower, and it was one of the gravest insults in their military vocabulary. The poet Archilochus famously wrote about abandoning his shield to save his life, and he was mocked for it across generations, because losing your shield didn't just mean you were vulnerable, it meant you'd broken the formation, exposed the man to your left, shattered the phalanx's integrity. The shield was heavy enough that warriors who fled often did throw them away to run faster, hence the Spartan mother's famous command to their sons, with your shield or on it. Return victorious or return dead carried on your shield. There was no third option. Now here's the tactical reality that made the Phalanx both powerful and vulnerable. Each hoplite carried his shield on his left arm, protecting his own left side and the right side of the man standing to his left. This created an overlapping shield wall, but it also created a fundamental asymmetry. The rightmost man in the formation had his right side exposed. The entire right flank of the Phalanx was the weak point, and every Greek commander knew it. In battle, phalanxes naturally drifted to the right as each man sought to get further behind his neighbour's shield, creating a wheel-like rotation as both formations tried to overlap the enemy's right flank. This wasn't cowardice, it was geometric necessity. The shield protected you and your neighbour, but only if you stayed in formation. Break that line, and the entire system collapsed. The Aspis could stop arrows cold. The combination of layered wood, bronze facing and curved surface made it nearly impenetrable to projectiles. Javelins that would punch through lighter shields glanced off or stuck harmlessly in the wood. Even direct spear thrusts from another hoplite, driven with the full force of a charging warrior, were deflected by the curvature, with experimental testing showing that only the most forceful overhead strikes could penetrate the bronze facing. But the shield had limits. That 16-pound weight, distributed efficiently though it was, still exhausted the bearer over time. Your left arm, even with the pawpacks, began to burn after minutes of holding the shield in combat position. The shield's size, 3 feet of diameter, made it unwieldy in broken terrain. In the narrow confines of Thermopylae, the Spartans' shields were an advantage, forming an impenetrable wall. In the rough hilly country or in individual combat, the Aspis became a liability, too heavy to maneuver effectively, too cumbersome to respond to attacks from multiple angles. And then there was the ultimate vulnerability. The shield was most effective when part of a wall. A lone hoplite with an Aspis was just a man carrying a heavy disc. He could protect his front, but his flanks and rear were exposed. His peripheral vision was already limited by his helmet. The shield blocked even more of his view. Fast, light infantry, peltists with javelins, learned to exploit this, harassing hoplites from the flanks, forcing them out of formation where they could be picked off individually. The famous defeat of Spartan hoplites by Athenian peltasts at Sphacteria in 425 BCE demonstrated this weakness brutally. In broken terrain, unable to maintain formation, the invincible Spartans were whittled down by troops they'd previously considered beneath contempt. But in its element, on flat ground, in tight formation, shield lock to shield, the Aspis transformed individual vulnerability into collective invincibility. The bronze-faced wooden dome that could deflect spears and arrows, the Argive grip that let you bear its weight for hours, the overlapping shield wall that protected every man except the last on the right flank. This wasn't a shield designed for heroic single combat. It was a shield designed for the Phalanx, for synchronized killing, for warfare as a mathematical problem solved through geometry and bronze. The Aspis made the hoplite, and the hoplite, arrayed in ranks with his brothers, made the Phalanx, and the Phalanx broke empires. The Doru was the hoplite's primary instrument of death, a spear measuring between 2.1 and 2.7 meters, roughly 7 to 9 feet in length, with a wooden shaft about 5 centimeters in diameter. The wood was typically cornel or ash, chosen for their combination of flexibility and strength, weighing anywhere from 2 to 4 pounds depending on the specific construction. At one end, a leaf-shaped iron spearhead, anywhere from 15 to 30 centimeters long, socketed onto the shaft and secured with resin or rivets. At the other end, the soriter, the lizard killer, a bronze or iron butt spike that served as counterweight, backup weapon, and the element that made the Dora far more than just a spear. The engineering of the Dora was deceptively sophisticated. That 9-foot length wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated to give the hoplite maximum reach while remaining controllable in formation. The first 3 ranks of the Phalanx could project their spears forward simultaneously, creating a bristling hedge of iron points that enemies had to penetrate before they could even reach the hoplite shields. A warrior facing the Phalanx wasn't confronting individual men. He was confronting 3 overlapping layers of spear points, each capable of punching through flesh and bone. The Doru gave the Phalanx its offensive reach, transforming a defensive shield wall into an advancing killing machine that could strike enemies before they could strike back. The spearhead itself was a masterwork of functional design. The leaf-shaped blade, wider in the middle and tapering to a point, wasn't just for aesthetics. That shape concentrated force at the tip for penetration, while providing enough cutting surface for the spear to be effective in slashing motions if needed. The diamond cross-section with its central ridge provided structural strength, preventing the blade from bending or snapping under the stress of repeated thrust into armor and bone. And the socket design, where the blade fitted over the wooden shaft rather than being tanged through it, meant that even if the shaft splintered, the spearhead could potentially be recovered and fitted to a replacement shaft. Nothing in hoplite warfare was wasted. Now, the Saurotor. Modern reconstructions often dismiss it as a simple counterweight, but ancient sources and archaeological evidence reveal it was far more versatile. Yes, it balanced the spear, positioning the center of mass closer to the warrior's grip and making the weapon easier to control, but it also allowed the spear to be planted in the ground, thrust into the earth to stand upright, giving the hoplite a moment's rest without dropping his primary weapon. More critically, the Saurotor was a backup killing tool. When the spearhead broke, and in the press of phalanx combat spears broke constantly, the hoplite could reverse his weapon and fight with the butt spike. It wasn't as effective as the proper spearhead, but it was far better than being disarmed. And in the chaos of the Othismos, when the phalanx had pushed forward over fallen enemies, the rear ranks could use their Saurotors to finish off wounded foes as they marched over them, ensuring no enemy remained alive behind the advancing line. The tactical employment of the Doru remains one of the most debated aspects of hoplite warfare. Ancient artwork shows hoplites wielding spears both overhand, held above the shoulder with the point angled down, and underhand, held at waist level with the point projecting forward. Modern experimental archaeology suggests both techniques were used depending on the tactical situation. The overhand grip, with the spear raised above and the thrust coming downward, delivered devastating force. By using the full body weight in a descending strike, essentially throwing the spear forward while maintaining grip, a hoplite could drive the spearhead through armor with enough force to penetrate the bronze cuirass. This was the killing blow, the technique used in the initial clash when the phalanxes made contact. The underhand grip with the spear tucked under the arm or held at waist level projecting forward over the shield offered different advantages. It was more defensive, allowing the hoplite to keep his spear point extended while maintaining maximum shield coverage. In tight formation, with shields overlapping and men pressed shoulder to shoulder, the underhand grip let the spear rest on or between shields, requiring less arm strength to maintain. It was also more useful for sustained combat, for the grinding middle phase of battle when the initial clash had ended and the phalanxes were locked in the Othismos. You couldn't maintain an overhand grip for minutes at a time, your arm would fail. But the underhand position, with the spear supported by the body and shield, could be held almost indefinitely. But spears break. In the compression of massed combat, with hundreds of men pushing forward, shields crashing into shields, and spear shafts tangling with armor and weapons, the wooden shaft of the Doru was under immense stress. Ash and Cornell were strong, but they weren't indestructible. Spears snapped. Spearheads were torn off. The primary weapon became useless pieces of wood. And when that happened, the hoplite reached for his secondary weapon, the Xiphos. The Xiphos was everything the Doru was not: short, between 45 and 60 centimeters of blade length, making the entire weapon less than 80 centimeters with the hilt. Light, around 2 pounds, and designed for brutally close quarters work. The blade was leaf-shaped, similar to the Doru's spearhead, double-edged for cutting from either side, with a distinctive waist where it narrowed before widening again toward the tip. This wasn't a weapon for heroic dueling or elegant swordplay. The Xiphos was a tool for killing in the press, for the moment when the formations had interpenetrated and warriors were too close for spears, when combat became a matter of inches rather than feet. The leaf-shaped blade made the Xiphos weight forward, suited for powerful hacking blows that could split helmets and crush bronze, but the acutely pointed tip and the sometimes narrower, straighter blade variations optimized it for thrusting. The diamond cross-section with its central ridge providing the structural rigidity needed to punch through armor without bending. In the chaos of close combat, when men were grappling shield to shield, the Xiphos was the weapon that decided outcomes. A quick thrust under the shield rim into the groin, a hacking slash to the exposed neck above the cuirass, a stab through the narrow eye slit of a Corinthian helmet. This was butcher's work, not warrior's art. The compact size that made the Xiphos deadly in the press was the same feature that made it practical for the hoplite to carry. Worn on a baldric, a diagonal belt across the body, the Xiphos hung at the warrior's left hip, out of the way of the massive Aspis shield. It didn't interfere with the spear, didn't tangle with the greaves or cuirass, and could be drawn with the right hand without dropping the shield. In the Phalanx, where every inch of space was accounted for and men fought shoulder to shoulder with barely room to breathe, a longer sword would have been a liability. The Xiphos was sized for the reality of hoplite combat. Tight, compressed, desperate. Historical accounts emphasize that the Xiphos was rarely the primary killing weapon. Battles were won and lost with the Doru. The spear's reach, its ability to project force from 3 ranks simultaneously, its effectiveness in maintaining formation, that's what made the Phalanx deadly. The Xiphos only emerged when the clean, organized phase of battle had dissolved into chaos, when the Phalanx had broken or interpenetrated with the enemy, when spears had shattered and warriors were pressed too close to use them. In those moments the short sword became the difference between living and dying, and in those moments hoplite warfare lost all pretense of glory and became what it always truly was, a desperate struggle to put iron into flesh before flesh received iron. Together, the Doru and Xiphos represented a 2-stage weapons system perfectly optimized for Phalanx warfare. The spear for reach, for formation combat, for the organized violence of massed infantry, the sword for survival, for the breakdown of order, for the intimate horror of killing at arm's length. Neither weapon was designed for individual heroism. Both were components of a larger tactical system that treated warriors as interchangeable parts of a killing machine. And that machine, when properly deployed with men who understood their weapons and their role in the formation, was nearly unstoppable. The question was never whether the weapons were effective. The question was whether the formation could be maintained long enough for them to do their work. Strip away the individual warrior and what remains is mathematics. The Phalanx was geometry made lethal, a formation that transformed courage into an algorithm and terror into tactical advantage. 8 ranks deep, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, but 8 was the standard that generations of Greek commanders settled on as optimal. Each man occupied roughly 3 feet of frontage in standard formation, shoulder pressed against shoulder, shield overlapping the shield of the man to his left. Do the calculation. 100 men across created a front of 300 feet, a solid wall of bronze and iron bristling with spear points, and behind that front rank stood 7 more ranks, each one adding weight, momentum, and psychological pressure to the formation. The genius of the Phalanx wasn't in its complexity, it was in its brutal simplicity. This wasn't a formation that required years of specialized training or aristocratic breeding. A farmer could learn to hold his position in line. A merchant could understand the basic principle. Stay in formation, protect your neighbor, and push forward. The Phalanx democratized warfare in a way that ancient civilizations had never seen, transforming citizen militias into forces that could defeat professional soldiers. But that simplicity came with rigid constraints. The Phalanx had 3 formation densities, each adapted for different tactical situations, and understanding these variations meant understanding how hoplite battles actually unfolded. The march formation, sometimes called the open order, gave each man approximately 6 feet of frontage, allowing the Phalanx to cover ground without exhausting the troops. At this spacing, hoplites could march for miles, shields resting on shoulders, spears held vertically or at rest. As the enemy came into view, commanders would order the shift to pike-in formation, the standard fighting density where each man occupied 3 feet of space. Shields now overlapped significantly, creating a continuous wall. The front 3 ranks could extend their spears forward, creating the characteristic hedgehog of iron points that defined Phalanx offense. And when the situation demanded maximum defensive power, when facing cavalry charges or intense missile fire, the Phalanx compressed further into Aspis, the locked shields formation, where each warrior occupied as little as 18 inches of frontage, and the formation depth halved as files compressed together into a nearly impenetrable mass of bronze. The transition between these formations required discipline that most ancient armies simply didn't possess. On command, shouted orders or horn signals cutting through the pre-battle chaos, thousands of men had to simultaneously adjust their spacing, close ranks, and maintain alignment. A gap in the line was death. A man who failed to close properly created a vulnerability that enemy spears would exploit instantly. The Greeks trained for this, drilling the formations until the movements became reflexive. City-states organized their phalanxes by tribal or regional affiliations, placing friends, neighbors, and family members side by side. This wasn't sentiment, it was tactical psychology. A man might break and run to save himself, but he wouldn't abandon his brother or his son. Shame was a more powerful motivator than courage. Now, the Othismos. This single word has generated more scholarly debate than perhaps any other aspect of ancient warfare, because the ancient sources describe it, but don't explain the mechanics in ways that satisfy modern analysis. Othismos means pushing or shoving, and ancient authors consistently describe it as the decisive phase of hoplite combat. But was it literal physical pushing? A rugby scrum, where rear ranks used their shields to shove the men in front forward in a grinding shoving match? Or was it metaphorical, describing the moral and psychological pressure of massed ranks pressing forward, maintaining momentum even as the front ranks fought and died? The traditional interpretation held that Othismos was exactly what it sounded like, a massive pushing contest. After the initial spear exchange, when the phalanxes made contact, the battle devolved into a literal shoving match. Men in the rear ranks placed their shields against the backs of the men in front and pushed with their full body weight. The entire formation became a single organism, attempting to physically drive the enemy backward through collective mass. The phalanx with greater depth, better cohesion, or more stubborn warriors in the front ranks would gradually push the enemy formation backward, breaking their cohesion and creating opportunities for spears to find flesh in the chaos. The evidence for this interpretation is compelling. Ancient sources consistently describe battles being won when one phalanx pushed back the other. The extraordinarily deep formations used by generals like Epaminondas of Thebes, phalanxes 50 ranks deep on one flank, only make tactical sense if you're trying to create overwhelming pushing power. The design of the Aspis itself, with its concave bowl shape, would fit naturally against the back of the man in front, creating a continuous surface for transferring force, and the casualty rates from hoplite battles support the model. Roughly 5% casualties for the winning side, 15% for the losers, with most deaths occurring during the rout when the losing formation finally broke and men turned to flee. If battles were decided by prolonged individual combat, you'd expect far higher casualties in the fighting phase itself. But recent scholarship has challenged this model, pointing out mechanical problems that make literal mass pushing difficult to reconcile with the evidence. A man in the front rank, squeezed between enemy shields in front and friendly shields behind, would have almost no ability to use his weapons. The compression would make spear thrusts nearly impossible, sword work completely impractical. Men would be crushed, trampled, unable to breathe in the press of bodies, and yet ancient sources describe sustained spear fighting during the Othismos, not just helpless men being crushed to death. The alternative model suggests Othismos was psychological, pushing. The front ranks fought at spear's reach in a series of individual combats, advancing and retreating in a fluid but organised manner, while rear ranks maintained forward pressure through moral support, replacing casualties and creating the collective momentum that prevented the front ranks from breaking. The truth, as archaeological and experimental evidence now suggests, probably lies between these extremes. The Othismos varied depending on the tactical situation and the phase of battle. In the initial clash, when phalanxes closed to contact, there was likely a brief moment of violent collision, shields crashing into shields, the shock of impact rippling through both formations. At this range, spears were the primary killing tools, thrust overhand into the gaps between shields, targeting faces, throats, the exposed right side where the enemy's shield didn't protect. Men in the front rank fought and died while rear ranks pressed forward, not in a continuous pushing scrum, but in surges, organised pushes that created moments of compression followed by brief releases as formations adjusted to casualties and gaps. As spears broke and the formations interpenetrated, the combat became closer, more chaotic. This is where swords emerged, where Othismos became more literal as warriors grappled shield to shield with no room to manoeuvre. The rear ranks pushed forward over the bodies of the fallen, maintaining pressure, preventing the front ranks from retreating even if they wanted to. The weight of 8 ranks of men behind you meant you couldn't step backward. You could only go forward or die where you stood. This created a psychological condition unique to phalanx warfare. The front rank warriors knew they were likely doomed, but the mass behind them made flight impossible, and collective action the only path to survival. The casualty rates tell the real story of phalanx combat. Research by historian Peter Krentz showed typical casualty rates of roughly 5% for victors and 15% for the defeated. But if you assume an 8-rank deep phalanx, and that most casualties occurred in the front ranks, the mathematics become horrifying. The winning side's front rank likely suffered 40% casualties. Nearly half the men in the killing line died or were seriously wounded. The loser's front rank was effectively annihilated. These weren't the casualties of prolonged individual combat. These were the casualties of men trapped in a killing zone, unable to retreat, forced to stand and receive spear thrusts until either they broke through or the enemy formation crumbled. The decisive moment in any phalanx battle came when one formation's cohesion finally shattered. The front rank, exhausted and bloodied, their shields heavy beyond bearing, their arms numb from wielding spears and absorbing impacts, would begin to waver. Gaps would appear in the line, and the moment those gaps appeared, the enemy spears would find them, driving through into the ranks behind. The psychological collapse happened almost instantaneously once it began. One man turned to flee, then another, then a section of the line, and suddenly the organised formation dissolved into a panicked mob of men throwing away their shields to run faster, trampling their own wounded, pursued by enemy light troops and cavalry who conducted the real slaughter of ancient warfare, the rout, where organised troops massacred fleeing enemies who could no longer defend themselves. This is why the Phalanx required discipline above all else. Individual courage mattered, but collective cohesion decided battles. A phalanx of brave men who broke formation would lose to a phalanx of frightened men who held their line. The poet Tyrtaeus captured this in verses sung before battle, emphasizing that it was better to die in the front ranks, standing with your comrades, than to survive by running. The Greeks understood something fundamental. Courage is a limited resource, but shame is eternal. Structure your formation to maximize shame for fleeing and minimize opportunities for individual cowardice, and you could sustain men through levels of horror that would break armies built on heroic ideals. The Phalanx turned warfare into engineering. Not the engineering of weapons or armor, but the engineering of human psychology. It was a machine designed to overcome the natural human instinct to flee from death, to stand in the face of spear thrusts and shield crashes, to maintain cohesion when every fibre of your being screamed to run. And for 3 centuries it worked better than anything else the ancient world could produce. Until it didn't. Every weapons system carries the seeds of its own obsolescence. The very characteristics that make a military innovation dominant in one context become fatal vulnerabilities when the context changes. The Hoplite Phalanx was no exception. For 3 centuries it dominated Mediterranean warfare, breaking Persian armies and deciding the fates of Greek city-states. But the system that made farmers into warriors and turned courage into geometry was fundamentally brittle. Its strengths and weaknesses were inseparable, 2 sides of the same bronze coin, and when commanders learned to exploit those weaknesses, the age of the hoplite began its inevitable decline. The first and most fundamental flaw was terrain dependency. The phalanx required flat, open ground to function, not preferred it, required it. The tight formation, the overlapping shields, the extended spears projecting forward in perfect alignment, all of this demanded level terrain where ranks could maintain their spacing and cohesion. On broken ground, hills, ravines, forests, rocky slopes, the formation simply disintegrated. Gaps appeared between files as men navigated obstacles at different speeds. The carefully maintained shield wall fractured. The synchronized advance became a stumbling mob, and once the formation broke, hoplites became isolated targets, their heavy armor transforming from protection into death sentence as lighter, more mobile troops surrounded and butchered them. Ancient commanders understood this limitation intimately. Battles were fought on carefully chosen fields, often by mutual agreement, because both sides needed terrain that favoured phalanx combat. The Greeks even had a term for it. They would give back the dead, a ritual acknowledgement of victory where the losing side formally requested permission to recover their fallen, implicitly admitting defeat. This ritual only made sense in a military culture where battles were fought on predictable terrain, between similar force structures. But when enemies refused to fight on Greek terms, the hoplites' vulnerabilities became catastrophic. The Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BCE provided the most humiliating demonstration of this weakness. A force of Spartan hoplites, the most feared warriors in Greece, men trained from childhood for nothing but war, found themselves trapped on a rocky island off the coast of Pylos. The Athenians, rather than meeting them in conventional battle, deployed peltasts, light infantry armed with javelins and minimal armour. These troops could move quickly over the broken terrain that hobbled the hoplites. They harassed the Spartans from range, raining javelins onto the heavy infantry who couldn't close to spear range. When the Spartans tried to form up, the peltasts scattered. When they broke formation to pursue, they were picked off individually. The vegetation that might have provided cover was deliberately burned away, leaving the hoplites exposed. Without light troops of their own to screen them, without the ability to maneuver effectively in rough terrain, the legendary Spartans were ground down over days of harassment until they finally surrendered, an act so shocking that it reverberated through Greek military thought for generations. This exposed the second fatal flaw. The Phalanx had virtually no tactical flexibility. Once engaged, it could only move in one direction, forward, turning the formation to face a new threat, disengaging from combat, wheeling to respond to flanking movements. All of these maneuvers were nearly impossible. The depth of the formation meant orders took time to propagate from commanders to rear ranks. The tight spacing meant individual movement was impossible without disrupting neighbours. And the shield configuration, each man's protection dependent on his left-hand neighbour, meant breaking ranks was catastrophic. The Phalanx was a hammer, devastating when brought down on an appropriate target, but utterly incapable of responding to threats from unexpected angles. The vulnerability to flanking attacks was inherent in the shield system itself. Every hoplite carried his Aspis on his left arm, protecting his left side and half of his neighbour to the left. This created the famous drift to the right in Phalanx combat, as each man unconsciously sought more protection behind his neighbour's shield. More critically, it meant the entire right flank of the formation was the vulnerable point, and the rear was almost completely unprotected. A Phalanx hit from the side or rear collapsed instantly. The shields couldn't cover those angles, the spears couldn't rotate to face threats, and the psychological cohesion that held men in the face of frontal assault shattered when death came from unexpected directions. Greek commanders compensated by anchoring flanks on terrain features, rivers, cliffs, ravines, that prevented envelopment. When such features weren't available, they deployed light troops or cavalry to screen the vulnerable flanks. But this created a strategic vulnerability. The Phalanx's effectiveness depended on combined arm support that citizen militias often couldn't provide. Cavalry was expensive, the domain of aristocrats. Light troops were considered inferior, less worthy of honour than hoplites. The social structure that enabled hoplite warfare, the middling class of citizens who could afford armour, also constrained the development of the supporting forces that could protect the Phalanx's weaknesses. The fourth flaw was strategic inflexibility. Hoplite warfare was built around decisive pitched battles fought by mutual consent on favourable terrain. This created a military culture that struggled with warfare of attrition, siege operations, naval conflict, and guerrilla tactics. The Peloponnesian War demonstrated this brutally. Despite decades of conflict between Athens and Sparta, the two preeminent military powers of Greece, there were only 3 major hoplite battles, and none proved strategically decisive. Instead, the war was decided by naval operations, raids, sieges, economic exhaustion, and the cultivation of client states. The hoplite Phalanx, for all its tactical dominance, was largely irrelevant to the strategic outcome. Warfare had evolved beyond the system that had defined it for centuries. The Macedonian reforms under Philip II represented both the perfection and the beginning of the end for hoplite warfare. Philip took the Phalanx concept and enhanced it with the sarissa, a pike measuring 18 to 20 feet, nearly twice the length of the traditional Doru. The Macedonian Phalanx could project 5 ranks of pikes forward simultaneously, creating an even more impenetrable hedge of iron. But Philip understood what Greek city-states had struggled with. The Phalanx needed integrated combined arm support. He paired his pike-wielding phalangites with elite cavalry, skirmishers, and more mobile hyperspist infantry who could protect flanks and exploit breakthroughs. Under Philip and his son Alexander, this integrated system conquered the known world. But the Macedonian phalanx was even more rigid than its hoplite predecessor, even more dependent on perfect terrain and protected flanks. When Rome brought its manipular legion system into contact with the Macedonian phalanx, the final vulnerability was exposed: brittleness. The Roman legion was organized into smaller units, maniples, that could operate semi-independently, respond to local threats, and reform after disruption. Where the phalanx was monolithic, the legion was modular. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, this difference proved decisive. The Macedonian phalanx initially drove the Romans back, its massive pikes unstoppable on level ground. But the uneven terrain near the river Leucas broke the formation's cohesion. Gaps appeared between files, and Roman legionaries trained to exploit such opportunities poured into the openings. At close range, where the unwieldy 18-foot sarissa was useless, the short Roman gladius butchered phalangites who couldn't defend themselves. The formation that had conquered an empire collapsed in an afternoon. 20,000 Macedonians died. The Romans lost less than 100 men. The lesson of Pydna wasn't that the phalanx was inherently inferior to the legion. It was that warfare had evolved beyond systems that demanded perfect conditions to function. The legion could fight on any terrain, could respond to threats from multiple directions, could break and reform without total collapse. It sacrificed some of the phalanx's overwhelming frontal power in exchange for tactical flexibility. And in the complex, multi-front conflicts of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, flexibility proved more valuable than raw power. The final, perhaps most profound flaw was social and economic. The hoplite system depended on citizen soldiers who could afford their own equipment, maintain their farms or businesses between campaigns, and return to civilian life after brief periods of service. This limited campaign duration, strategic options, and professionalization. As warfare became more complex and long-duration campaigns more common, the citizen-soldier model became increasingly obsolete. Professional armies with state-provided equipment, year-round training, and integrated command structures simply outperformed civic militias, no matter how brave or well-equipped the individual warriors. The hoplite didn't disappear overnight. Greek mercenaries served in armies across the Mediterranean for centuries after the classical period, but they served as components of more complex military systems, not as the decisive arm. The age when armoured citizens standing shoulder to shoulder could break empires had ended. Warfare had moved beyond them, demanding flexibility, strategic depth, and professional expertise that the hoplite system was never designed to provide. The killing machine that had dominated for 300 years became a historical curiosity, remembered more for its cultural impact than its tactical relevance. The phalanx that broke Persia was broken in turn by forces that understood what the Greeks had refused to fully acknowledge, that the strengths that make a system dominant also contain the seeds of its defeat. Before we close out this journey into the brutal reality of ancient warfare, take a moment to check out the Wars in History merch store. We've got designs that capture the raw power and uncompromising truth of military history, shirts, hoodies, and gear for those who appreciate warfare as it actually was, not as Hollywood imagines it. Link in the description. Now, let's bring this home. The hoplite was never a hero. He was a solution to a problem, The problem was survival in a world where city-states clawed at each other for resources, territory, and dominance, where professional armies were economically unsustainable, where individual valor wasn't enough to stop organized violence. The Greeks didn't set out to create a romantic ideal of citizenship and warfare. They engineered a system that turned ordinary men into components of a machine that could kill efficiently, survive contact with superior numbers, and return to their farms when the killing was done. 70 pounds of bronze and iron, a shield too heavy to carry comfortably but perfectly balanced for the push, a spear designed for the first 3 ranks to thrust simultaneously. A formation that made cowardice physically impossible and courage tactically irrelevant. This wasn't warfare as mythology presented it, champions meeting in single combat while armies watched. This was industrialized violence, mathematics applied to murder, geometry enforcing collective survival over individual instinct, and it worked. For 3 centuries, the Hoplite Phalanx was the dominant force in Mediterranean warfare. It broke the Persian Empire at Marathon. It ground down rival city-states in countless conflicts across Greece. It made Alexander's conquest possible, even as his father refined it into something more versatile and more deadly. The system that transformed citizens into warriors created the political and military foundation for Western civilization itself. But the same characteristics that made the Phalanx dominant also ensured its obsolescence. The formation that was unstoppable on flat ground became a death trap in broken terrain. The cohesion that held men together in the face of frontal assault shattered when threats came from unexpected angles. The simplicity that made farmers into functional soldiers also made the system rigid, unable to adapt to tactical innovations and strategic changes. The Phalanx was a hammer, and when warfare stopped resembling nails, the hammer became a museum piece. What remains is the legacy. The idea that citizen soldiers, properly organized and equipped, could defeat professional armies. The concept that warfare could be systematized, that courage could be engineered through formation and social pressure. The understanding that individual weakness, when properly structured, becomes collective strength. Every military formation that followed, the Roman legion, the medieval pike, square, the Napoleonic infantry column, owed something to the principles the Greeks pioneered. The Hoplite didn't invent organized infantry warfare, but he perfected a version of it that echoed through military history for millennia. And at the center of it all was the brutal truth we started with. The Hoplite wasn't designed for glory. He was designed for survival through organized slaughter. The front ranks knew they were doomed. 40% casualties for winners, near total annihilation for losers. But the formation made their cowardice irrelevant and their sacrifice inevitable. Stand in line, hold your shield, protect your neighbor, push forward, and if you died with honor, your body recovered by your comrades, your name remembered in your city's monuments. But make no mistake, you died doing mathematics. Your death was a calculation in the algebra of mass combat, your life expended as part of an equation that produced victory for the collective at the cost of individuals. This is what we forget when we romanticize ancient warfare. The bronze armor that catches the light in museum displays was worn by men whose arms burned from its weight after minutes of combat. The perfectly preserved helmets with their elegant cheek guards blinded and deafened the warriors who wore them. The Aspis that looks so impressive in archaeological photography weighed 16 pounds and had to be held in position, while spears slammed into it and men shoved from behind, trapping you in a press of bronze and flesh where you couldn't retreat even if you wanted to. The Hoplite was a killing machine, not metaphorically, literally. A human component in a larger mechanism designed to project force, absorb casualties, and maintain cohesion long enough for the enemy formation to break first. And it worked precisely because it was engineered, not inspired. Because it accounted for human weakness and structured around it. Because it understood that warfare isn't decided by the bravest individual but by the formation that breaks last. That's the anatomy we've dissected here. The panoply that turned flesh into bronze, the shield that protected your neighbour more than yourself, the weapons that killed at 9 feet and 9 inches, the formation that made courage collective and cowardice impossible, and the fatal flaws that eventually rendered the entire system obsolete, swept aside by more flexible, more adaptable ways of organised violence. The age of the hoplite ended. But the lesson remains. Warfare is engineering, and the most effective engineers are the ones who understand that human beings, for all their potential for courage and nobility, are fundamentally components in larger systems. The Greeks understood this. They built their military around it, and for 3 centuries that understanding made them the most dangerous warriors in the known world. This was the brutal truth of the hoplite. This was the anatomy of a killing machine. This is wars in history, and this is how warfare actually worked. If this deep dive into the mechanics of ancient warfare added value to your understanding of military history, consider supporting the channel on Ko-fi. Link in the description. Your support lets us continue producing these detailed, no-nonsense explorations of warfare as it really was. Brutal, calculated, and fascinating. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp, and remember, history doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about what worked.